The gap. Over the last year and a half or so, I've done a little bit of archery. I am in no way claiming any sort of expertise in this endeavor. I wouldn't even go so far as to call myself proficient with a bow. But archery has been an enjoyable little hobby. Admittedly, I don't put in the time and effort to develop a high level of mastery at this stage, but I enjoy new experiences, especially those that require some skill development. Archery is fun. There's an excitement when I hit my intended target, and it's a bit meditative. It's simple and focused and visceral. I like that sort of thing, and I have become fascinated with the gap. In archery, the gap is the space between the aiming point and where the arrow actually lands. When anyone starts to shoot a bow for the first time, he or she must identify his or her gap. The gap depends on many things: variances in equipment, mechanical errors of technique, the physical traits and aptitudes of the archer, and, of course, the distance to the intended target. I, for instance, have a tendency to shoot high, meaning if I'm shooting without a sight at a pretty elementary distance of, say, 20 yards or so, and I aim the arrow directly at the target, my arrow tends to hit significantly higher than my aiming point. I am certain there are many things wrong with my approach, but that's not my focus here. My emphasis is on the gap. As in archery, there are gaps in life, those spaces between our intended targets and our actual results. We all have hopes and dreams and goals. We all have expectations about how our lives will turn out, but we often fail to hit our targets, at least on our first attempts. We aim for a goal, and we miss it. We form an expectation, but then we have an experience that runs counter to our initial hopes. We fall short in some way. When we do miss our targets, there are really only two options: give up and live with the mess, or identify the gap and go about adjusting. In archery, the quickest way to compensate for a gap is to adjust our aim. If I loose my first arrow and it hits high on the target, I try to aim that much lower on the next shot. That's pretty obvious, but when I first started dabbling in archery, I would shoot arrow after arrow high on the target without adjusting my aim. I'd even get a nice grouping of arrows all directly above my aiming point, but it wouldn't occur to me to simply lower my aim. I would be confused. I'd assume I was making some technical error, which I imagine I was, and I would try to make little corrections in my form. That's not a bad thing, but I wouldn't make the simplest adjustment of simply lowering my aiming point. I just kept putting my arrow at the bullseye, expecting a different result. Many are familiar with the famous quote attributed to Albert Einstein, wherein he defines insanity as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. As it turns out, that Einstein fellow was pretty bright, because that's something most of us do from time to time. We consistently miss our marks, but we don't adjust our aim. We shoot blindly, or we think we know more than we do. We let others define our aims, and we wind up missing the target. We end up working jobs we don't love, trudging through unfulfilling relationships, living uninspired lives, and we still don't think to adjust our approach. Oftentimes in archery, a missed target is the result of some small error in execution extrapolated through the flight of the arrow. The error may not be noticeable at close range, but as we gain some distance, the gap gets wider and our mistake becomes more apparent. Life is the same. Small flaws in our behavior go unnoticed until some calamity reveals our faults and provides the necessary separation to see them. That's one of the harsh realities of life. We often don't see our shortcomings until it's too late, until we've already failed. And in those instances, we can only look at our missed targets and work to close our gaps. Archery requires continual little adjustments in approach, and so does life. It's about identifying those little deficiencies, tweaking things, and working toward consistent and repeatable behavior. We all have our natural gaps, our inherent aptitudes and personality traits that sometimes don't serve us as we would like. We have to be honest about those characteristics and how they might be keeping us from hitting our targets, or we can never make the necessary adjustments. We must also note that in life, as in archery, the farther the target, the greater the gap. An arrow pointed directly at a distant target won't hit its mark. An archer has to account for his own natural gap, the drop of the arrow over the long distance. That's what we have to do in life as well. We must adjust our behaviors to address our personal gaps and the gap created by the distance to our goal. If our goal is to run a marathon, we have to look at ourselves and honestly ask how far we are from that goal. If we've never regularly exercised, we probably shouldn't just hop off the couch, dust the Cheeto crumbs off our shirt, and dive into the 26.2-mile jaunt. We need to recognize our own gaps. That might mean improving our diet and starting an exercise program. It might also mean getting more sleep and watching less Netflix. Whatever it is, we have to first recognize and address our own behaviors before we can start to close the gap. Once we start addressing our individual gaps, we can start to look at the distance to the goal. If we haven't run a lap since high school gym class, a marathon looks pretty far away. And oftentimes, when a goal appears too far off, we simply abandon it. We're sure we won't hit the target, and we save ourselves the embarrassment, and we just don't try. Truth be told, we probably wouldn't hit the target, at least not on the first attempt, not without working to close the gaps. Looking at a marathon for a first-time runner might seem overwhelming, so we have to adjust our aim. We start wherever we're capable of starting. Maybe it starts with walking around the block. Then it's a jog. Maybe we work our way up to running for 5 minutes, then 10, then 20. Maybe we enter a couple local 5Ks, and we eventually sign up for a half marathon. We do it. We run the thing, and we don't stop. We've closed down our own gaps, and now the marathon isn't so far away. It's not some barely visible target off on the horizon. It's right there. And we can take our shot. That's what it's all about. We loose one arrow after the next, adjusting and getting closer with each shot until finally we hit the bullseye. We all have our natural gaps, and some targets may be farther away than others, but we can hit them. Some of us might have to adjust more than others. We might have to take more shots, but that's fine. When we only look at the target, we lose sight of the journey necessary to reach it. We fail to realize that sometimes we have to aim somewhere other than the target. We get frustrated and sad and depressed when our lives don't match our blueprints, when we don't hit our targets. But we have to understand that we just need to make adjustments. We might have to change our behaviors, alter our approach. We might have to change where we aim. We won't always hit the target, and that's okay. We just have to be willing to take the next shot. Thank you.